There's something about The Walking Dead that just doesn't let you go. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean it in the way that, it's 2 a.m. and you find yourself down a rabbit hole about a throwaway moment from season 3 that apparently has 17 different fan interpretations, and you're reading Reddit threads from 2014 like they're breaking news. That's sort of the thing about this show. It ran for 11 seasons. It spawned something like 5 or 6 spin-offs, depending on how you're counting. It had one of the most talked about moments in cable television history, a season 6 finale cliffhanger that basically broke the internet for 6 months. And through all of it, through the peaks and the rough patches and the bits where it maybe overstayed its welcome a little, it kept generating theories, constantly, persistently. The kind of theories that don't die just because the show ended. And that's actually quite rare if you think about it. Most shows, when they finish, the theorizing kind of wraps up with them. You get a final explanation, people process their feelings, and then everyone moves on. The Walking Dead is different because it deliberately left so many things half-answered. There's the origin of the virus, which the show avoided explaining for over a decade. There's the question of what certain characters actually knew and when they knew it. There's the whole mythology of the helicopter group that the show introduced in season 1 and only started unpacking in season 9. There's the question of who certain people really are, biologically, psychologically, morally. And Robert Kirkman, the creator of the comic the show was based on, was famously allergic to clean answers. He'd tease things on Twitter and then delete the tweets. He'd confirm theories in panel Q&As and then sort of walk it back. He once told an audience the zombie origin was a sci-fi thing that would make the story all that much weirder, and then posted a single-word answer on Twitter 2 years later and deleted that too. The man seemed genuinely allergic to closure, which is frustrating if you want clean answers, but brilliant if you want a fandom that never stops thinking. So tonight, or this morning, whatever time it is for you, I want to go through the theories I find most interesting. Not just the famous ones, though some of those are here too, but the ones that actually change the way the show feels when you hold them up against it. The ones where you go, oh, that's actually quite clever. I don't know if it's true, but it's clever. There are 10 of them, roughly. We'll take them at a nice slow pace, no rush. And before we get into it, if you're enjoying this sort of thing and you want more of it, it would genuinely mean a lot if you took a moment to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really does help this channel more than you might think. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's get into it. There's also something about the specific shape of the show that makes it so good for theorizing. It's not like a murder mystery, where there's a correct answer buried in the text and the fun is in finding it. It's more like the show built a world and then left large portions of that world unexplained. And the explanations fans invented are sometimes more interesting than the ones the show eventually gave. The virus origin is maybe the clearest example of that. We'll get to it, but it's true of smaller things too. The helicopter in season 1. The phone calls Rick makes in the prison. The way certain characters seem to have histories, the show gestures at, but never quite fills in. Part of the reason the theories are so good is that The Walking Dead was, in its best periods, genuinely careful about its own mythology. The Jenna whisper in the season 1 finale wasn't a throwaway moment. It was planted specifically to be paid off later, and when it was paid off, it was devastating. The show at its best trusted the audience to hold on to things, and an audience that's been trained to hold on to things will hold on to everything, including the things that were never meant to mean anything. The helicopter in episode 1 probably wasn't planned as a 9-season thread, but once the audience was trained to notice details, they noticed that one too. So some of what we're going through tonight is confirmed. Some of it is fan-built and fascinating. Some of it is confirmed in the sense that Kirkman said something about it in an interview or a tweet and then possibly walked it back. The show's relationship with its own answers is genuinely strange, and I think that's worth acknowledging up front. When the person who created the story keeps giving and then taking back explanations, it means either he changed his mind about what the story was doing, or he's enjoying the mystery, or both at once. For what it's worth, I find both possibilities equally charming. There's also something worth saying about the specific culture the show built around its own mysteries. The Walking Dead fandom, at its peak, was doing something that felt different from most television fandoms. It was forensic in a way that felt almost academic. People were going back through early seasons with pause buttons and zoomed-in screenshots, cataloguing background details, cross-referencing dialogue, building documents that traced specific items or symbols through multiple episodes across multiple seasons. The helicopter theory is the most famous example, but it wasn't the only one. There were communities of people tracking Walker makeup continuity, trying to establish the geography of the outbreak from background news broadcast dialogue, mapping the symbolic language of the show's recurring visual motifs. That kind of engagement doesn't happen unless the show genuinely rewarded it. And it did, at its best. The details were there. The payoffs were real. And even when a specific theory turned out to be wrong, the process of building it, of going carefully through something you loved and asking what it was really doing, was its own reward. That's the culture we're in tonight, really. Still doing the same thing, just a bit slower and with fewer stakes, which feels like the right energy for this particular hour. So, let's get into it. Right, so this is the oldest one. The one that has been around since roughly the second week the show was on air, and that has survived multiple debunkings, multiple pieces of contradicting evidence, and at least 2 direct statements from Robert Kirkman himself. It simply refuses to go away. And I think the reason it refuses to go away is not because the evidence is overwhelmingly strong, but because it speaks to something that the show itself keeps poking at. The question of whether any of what we're watching is real. The theory is this: Rick Grimes never actually woke up from his coma. Everything we've watched, hundreds of deaths, the rise and fall of a dozen communities, the zombie apocalypse itself, is happening inside the head of a man in a hospital bed in King County, Georgia, who was shot in the line of duty and has never regained consciousness. Now, the case for this is not nothing. Let me walk through it properly. Rick wakes up in a hospital that is completely empty. No staff, no other patients, no explanation for how he survived. His IV bag hasn't run dry. There's food on a tray nearby. The building should be chaotic. It's the middle of a zombie outbreak. But the ward he's in is quiet and oddly preserved, like a setting that was arranged for him specifically. If you were writing a dream, you'd start it exactly like that. A familiar place, slightly wrong, with no explanation for the wrongness. Then there's the structure of the show itself. A coma dream tends to populate itself with people the dreamer knows, reshuffled into new roles. The people in your life become characters in the story your brain is telling. And the theory points out that the major figures in Rick's life, his wife, his best friend, his son, are already present and accounted for before the coma begins. Laurie, Shane, Carl, they're not new people he meets in the apocalypse. They're his people, playing slightly heightened versions of the tensions that already existed. Shane's jealousy over Laurie was presumably already a thing. Carl's need for his father was already a thing. The apocalypse just gives those dynamics room to breathe in ways a normal life wouldn't. There's a comparison to The Wizard of Oz that fans made quite early on, which I find genuinely charming. Dorothy, knocked unconscious, dreams of a fantastical world populated by people she knows from Kansas. Her farmhands become the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion. Her fears and wishes and unresolved feelings all get mapped onto the people she already loves. The theory is that Rick's coma does the same thing. Herschel, the kind older farmer who becomes a moral anchor for the group, maps onto some paternal figure in Rick's real life. The governor, either monster with a human face who runs a small kingdom, maps onto some authority Rick resents or fears. Negan is basically just a nightmare version of the kind of man Rick probably arrested a few times on the job. It's a neat framework. I don't know that it holds up under serious scrutiny, but it's neat. And then there's Kirkman, who did, on Twitter, say the following: Rick is not still in a coma. The events of TWD are definitely happening. Pretty clear. Pretty unambiguous. Case closed, you'd think. Except that in the very next tweet, and this is the part that makes the whole thing worse, he said, "But Carl and everyone else are all imagined. He actually never found his family. He's been crazy since he killed his first zombie." And then he put a hashtag that just said joking. The question mark is doing a lot of work there. Because if it was fully a joke, you just say it was a joke. You don't put a question mark on the hashtag. You don't make the denial and the confirmation arrive in back-to-back tweets like you're setting up a bit. Scott Gimple, one of the showrunners, was asked about the coma theory later and said with what sounds like genuine affection, "I do like people who still believe that Rick is still in that bed." He confirmed Rick is awake. But the way he said it, like fans who believe otherwise are doing something sweet, suggests there's something in the theory worth holding on to, even if it's not literally true. And I think what's worth holding on to is this. The show is, at its core, about a man who woke up in a world that had become unrecognisable and had to build meaning from scratch. Whether that's literally because he was in a coma or figuratively because the world ended while he was unconscious doesn't change what the story's doing. It's the same story either way. A man lost everything familiar and had to decide who he was going to be inside a reality that offered him no guideposts. The coma theory doesn't need to be true to be the right reading of the show. That's probably why it won't die. And there are a few smaller details that fans added over the years to shore up the theory, some more convincing than others. There's the observation that the show's most traumatic emotional beats tend to arrive in very clean narrative packages. The death of Sophia resolving exactly when Rick needed a reason to become a harder leader. The loss of Laurie arriving at exactly the moment the show needed him to break down and rebuild. Dreams or coma hallucinations tend to structure themselves around what the dreamer needs to process. They're not random, they're shaped by the subconscious. The Walking Dead's plot at times has the structure of a series of emotional tests rather than a series of realistic events. There's also a minor but interesting thread about the CDC episode specifically. When Jenna shows Rick and the group the brain scan, the process of dying and turning, the lights going out, he describes it as the electricity fading and then restarting in the brainstem. The lights go out, and then something basic and primitive switches back on. Fans pointed out that this is a reasonable description of what happens in certain kinds of coma. The higher brain functions go dark. Something lower, something older, keeps ticking. Rick's coma, in this reading, is what the walkers experience in reverse. He's the walker who woke back up. That's maybe a stretch, but it's the kind of stretch that feels like it fits. The theory also gave the ending of Rick's arc a different meaning for the people who held onto it. Rick being taken by the helicopter in Season 9, believed dead, eventually revealed to be alive. If you believe the whole thing is a coma dream, then the helicopter is the moment the dream starts to break down. Something is pulling him toward consciousness. Michonne going to find him is the dreaming mind searching for a way back to the surface. None of that is what the show was actually doing. But it's a coherent alternative reading, and the fact that it coheres is part of what makes it so durable. I asked someone once why they still believed in the coma theory after Kirkman debunked it, and they said something I found quite good. I don't believe the events aren't real. I believe they're real within the dream, which is the only way they can be real. That's a more sophisticated version of the theory than I usually see written down. The dream isn't false. It's the most true thing happening to Rick. It's just that the frame of reality it exists in isn't the waking world, which is, again, the whole show, really. The apocalypse strips away the false frames people live inside, the routines, the social performances, the distractions, and forces them into a version of reality that is more immediate and more honest. Whether that happens literally or metaphorically makes less difference than you'd think. One more thing about the coma theory that I find genuinely interesting, and then we'll move on. There's a specific detail in the pilot episode that fans who believe this theory cite quite often, and it's one I hadn't noticed on my first watch. When Rick wakes up in the hospital, the building is quiet and wrong in the specific ways we've talked about. But when he gets outside and starts moving through the world, the show presents certain things in a slightly dreamlike way. Transitions that are a bit too clean, events that resolve a bit too conveniently, people who appear at exactly the right moment. The show eventually stopped doing this as it became more confident in its own naturalism. But in the pilot, there's a quality to the storytelling that is slightly different from what came after. The pilot was, of course, directed by Frank Darabont, who made The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, and whose visual sensibility was always a bit more heightened and symbolic than what a standard television director would bring. You could attribute the dreamlike quality entirely to his style. Or you could attribute it to the fact that the story being told is, at some level, a dream, and that the person who created the pilot was unconsciously encoding that quality into how the thing looked. Darabont left the show after season 1 under difficult circumstances. The dreamlike quality went with him, more or less. I don't know what to do with that exactly. It might be nothing. It's probably nothing. But the theory is richer for it. Right, so this one is a lot more fun, and also, in some ways, more plausible than it has any right to be. The theory goes like this: Breaking Bad and The Walking Dead take place in the same universe. The events of Breaking Bad, Walter White's transformation into a drug lord, the manufacturing and distribution of his chemically distinctive blue methamphetamine, the violence and chaos that followed, happen in the years just before the zombie apocalypse. Breaking Bad is, in effect, the prequel to The Walking Dead. One man's decision to cook meth in an Albuquerque RV is somehow connected to the end of the world. Now, at the surface level, this sounds like the kind of thing people say when they've been awake too long. But then you start looking at the evidence, and it's genuinely strange how much of it there is. The first piece, and the one that started the whole theory back around season 2, is the blue meth. When Daryl finds Merle's drug stash while searching for supplies, there are blue crystals at the bottom. Not clear crystals, not white crystals, blue. Blue meth was not a real thing that existed in any meaningful quantity before Breaking Bad invented it as a fiction. It's not a naturally occurring colour for methamphetamine. It was specifically created by Vince Gilligan's writers to make Heisenberg's product distinctive and recognisable. So its presence in Merle's stash is, at minimum, a very specific wink. Robert Kirkman confirmed it was deliberate. He called it a little Easter egg we were doing for AMC fans, which is the honest, boring explanation. Both shows aired on the same network, the writers knew each other, someone thought it would be fun. Fair enough. But then there's the second piece, which Kirkman said nothing about. In season 4, Daryl tells Beth a story about one of Merle's dealers. He describes the man as a janky little white guy, a tweaker, and then, this is the bit, he says the dealer pulled a gun on him and said, "I'm gonna kill you, bitch." The word bitch in that specific usage, delivered by a janky little white guy who deals drugs, is one of the most recognisable verbal tics of Jesse Pinkman. It's practically his catchphrase across 5 seasons of Breaking Bad. The writers knew that. The audience knew that. It's a very specific choice. And then there's the car. Glenn, in season 1, drives a red Dodge Challenger with black racing stripes out of Atlanta. That exact car, same model, same year, same colour, is the car Walter White buys impulsively for his son in Breaking Bad, before being talked into returning it. The car salesman Walter deals with is named Glenn. Not a Glenn who looks like the character from The Walking Dead, just Glenn. A name attached to a transaction involving a red challenger. When you add those three together, the blue meth, the Jesse Pinkman dealer, the Glenn and the challenger, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like someone at AMC enjoying themselves very quietly. The more elaborate version of the theory, which fans built out from those foundation pieces, is that Walter White's meth was somehow the vector for the zombie virus, that the chemical compound he created, or the distribution network that spread it, or the chaos it generated in New Mexico and beyond, is connected to whatever pathogen eventually ended the world. There's a particularly vivid version that suggests Gus Fring, blown up at the end of Breaking Bad, surviving just long enough to straighten his tie and then die, was the first walker. The theory says Gus Fring is patient zero, standing in a nursing home corridor adjusting his tie. I don't know. That's maybe a stretch, but it's a very fun stretch. The more grounded version is simply, the two shows exist in the same fictional universe. The zombie virus was already circulating before the events of either show, and the people in Breaking Bad are living in the last few years of a world that's about to end. Walter White dies in 2010. The zombie outbreak in The Walking Dead begins not long after. Whether his meth caused anything or not, he lived and died in the same universe as Rick Grimes, just a few states over and a few years earlier. AMC, for what it's worth, has never confirmed this officially. But they've also never denied it, and they keep dropping little nods into the spin-offs. The Negro Yazul song from Breaking Bad appeared in Fear the Walking Dead. The network clearly enjoys the connection, even if it won't commit to it. And there's something kind of beautiful about the idea, honestly. One story about a man who chose to become the worst version of himself. Another story about a man trying to become the best version of himself in the worst possible circumstances. Both on the same channel in the same universe, a few years apart. One ends with a body in a meth lab. The Walking Dead has a pivotal mid-series moment with a bridge explosion and a helicopter. No notes really. There's an extended version of this theory that occasionally circulates, which I find particularly fun, even if it's completely unprovable. The idea is that the Walker virus already existed in a dormant form before the zombie apocalypse, consistent with what we know about the Jenner reveal, and that it existed at a low level in the water table or the air in certain parts of the American Southwest. When Walter White began cooking his blue meth in the desert outside Albuquerque, his process involved chemicals and heat conditions that nobody had combined in quite that way before. The theory suggests this chemical process interacted with the dormant virus already present in the local environment and accelerated its mutation. Not caused it, accelerated it. It's the kind of theory that you'd reject immediately if someone made it seriously. But that becomes oddly charming when you sit with it as a thought experiment. One man's vanity project. I'm going to cook the best meth anyone has ever cooked. I need to matter. I need to be the one. Inadvertently nudging the apocalypse forward by a few months or years. The whole world ending slightly sooner because a dying chemistry teacher wanted to feel exceptional. That's very bleak and also very funny, in the particular way that the best dark humour is both at once. The El Camino connection is worth a mention too, just briefly. El Camino, the Breaking Bad movie, was released in 2019. Jesse Pinkman escapes, heads north to Alaska, and the story ends. If the Breaking Bad and Walking Dead universes are connected, then somewhere in the snowy north of America, there is a former drug cook living quietly off-grid, while the zombie apocalypse slowly begins further south. Jesse Pinkman, of all people, might be one of the survivors. He's already been through something that broke most people, already rebuilt himself from almost nothing, already proven he can function outside normal society. He'd probably do fine. I don't know. It might just be a set of Easter eggs from a network that liked the synergy between its two prestige shows. But the specificity of the connections, the kihya, the blue crystals, the batch, the exact car, the name Glenn, suggests that even if it was always intended as pure fan service, someone on one of those shows enjoyed it enough to keep adding to it. That feels like intention of a kind, even if it's not the official canon kind. One small thing worth noting: the timelines actually work. Breaking Bad runs from roughly 2008 to 2010. The Walking Dead zombie outbreak begins, according to the show's internal chronology, sometime in 2010 or 2011. There's no continuity problem with placing both shows in the same world. Walter White's story ends just as Rick Grimes' story begins. The meth empire rises and falls in the years when the virus is presumably spreading. Jesse gets on a road to Alaska in the same general period that walkers are starting to appear. If AMC ever wanted to make the connection canonical, they could. They've never done it, and probably never will, because officially, acknowledging a shared universe creates continuity obligations that neither show's mythology really needs. But the temporal fit is genuinely clean, which is maybe why the theory has survived for so long. It doesn't require bending time or geography. It just requires accepting that two things happened on the same map at the same time. This one has a strange arc because the show spent over a decade treating the origin of the zombie virus as something sacred and unknowable, and then quietly answered the question in a post-credits scene that aired in 2021 on a spin-off that most people weren't watching. And the answer they gave doesn't fully match the answer Kirkman had been hinting at, and neither of those answers fully matches what fans had built up in the meantime. It's a bit of a mess is what I'm saying, but it's a fascinating mess. Start at the beginning. The main Walking Dead series never explained the origin of the zombies. No patient zero. No government lab. No chemical spill. No meteor. You didn't know, the characters didn't know, and Kirkman seemed quite committed to keeping it that way. He said in 2017 at San Diego Comic-Con that revealing the origin would make the show boring. His reasoning was that the show was about people, not about the virus, and that giving the virus a clear scientific backstory would shift the audience's attention in the wrong direction. That was the official position. Then a year later, he said it was a sci-fi thing that would make the story all that much weirder, which is obviously not nothing. Sci-fi's doing a lot of work in that sentence. You don't say sci-fi thing to mean biological experiment. You say sci-fi thing to mean something from outside the normal parameters of the world. Then in 2020, on Twitter, Kirkman posted a reply to a fan who asked about the origin directly. He said, "Space spores." According to Kirkman's tweet, a space spore reached Earth and spores were the catalyst. The spores were the catalyst. Done. That tweet has since been deleted. The 2021 is gone too. The paper trail of Kirkman's candid answers to this question has been quietly cleared from the internet, which is either a lawyer thing or a continuity thing, or just Kirkman being Kirkman, but people screenshotted them at the time. They're documented, they're out there. Kirkman had been joking about the space spores idea for years, actually. There was a short story in the comics in 2013 called Small Bites, written by someone other than Kirkman, that addressed the origin directly and pointed at an alien crash landing as the source. It's written in a slightly different register from the main comic, a bit more tongue-in-cheek, so it's easy to read as a joke. But Kirkman's 2020 tweet suggests he was at least comfortable treating it as the canonical answer, even if he later wanted to walk it back. And then there's what the show actually did. The Walking Dead, World Beyond, the spin-off that ran for 2 seasons and dealt mostly with young survivors, and the CRM, ended with a post-credits scene set in France, a deserted biomedical laboratory. The words "Les morts sont nés ici" on the wall, which translates to "the dead are born here." A French researcher and a survivor arguing in front of what appears to be zombie test subjects. The implication is clear. Whatever research team worked out of that lab had a hand in creating, or at minimum spreading, the pathogen that ended the world. Research teams called Primrose and Violet are mentioned in connection to the facility. The attempts to cure the virus by mutating it went badly, and instead produced deadlier variant strains rather than eliminating the disease. So in the show's actual mythology, The origin isn't space, it's human error. A laboratory somewhere in France, a pathogen that escaped containment, and a world that ended because a research team failed. The variant walkers you see in the Daryl Dixon spin-off, the ones called burners, which move with more aggression and apparent awareness than the walkers we'd spent years getting used to, are the direct result of those failed mutation experiments. The French lab didn't just cause the apocalypse, its botched cure attempts are still generating new consequences years later. What I find interesting is the gap between the space spores answer and the French lab answer. One is alien and accidental and cosmically indifferent. The universe coughed and we all died. The other is human and local and entirely preventable. We did it to ourselves, in a laboratory, while trying to do something good. Those are very different stories about what the apocalypse means. The second one is darker in a way. The idea that the world ended because of human overconfidence in a French biomedical research facility is somehow more frightening than the idea it ended because of extraterrestrial contamination. We can't blame the stars. It was us. But here's a fun detail that often gets missed in discussions of this theory. The world beyond post-credits scene doesn't actually show us who created the pathogen. It shows us the laboratory where research was conducted and where things went catastrophically wrong. The inscription, Les morts sont nés ici, the dead are born here, is about this specific facility, but the question of whether the pathogen was created here from scratch or whether it was brought here from somewhere else and modified is never definitively answered. There's a reading of the scene where the French researchers weren't the origin, but were the people who turned a manageable problem into a global catastrophe by trying to fix it, which is a rather pointed observation about scientific overconfidence in general, now that I think about it. The other thing about the deleted tweets is worth sitting with for a moment, because the pattern is strange. Kirkman says something candid, space spores, and then the tweet disappears. He says something specific about the sci-fi nature of the origin, and that tweet also disappears. It's not like he forgot about them. You don't accidentally delete archived tweets. Someone made a decision to remove those statements from the public record, which implies that at some point the direction of the franchise's mythology changed and the old answers stopped fitting. The most generous reading is that the franchise is still being planned, and the people planning it didn't want to be held to a casual Twitter answer from years ago. The less generous reading is that the space spores idea was always a bit of a joke that got out of hand, and the French lab answer from World Beyond was the first time anyone actually committed to a direction in writing. Either way, the origin story the show eventually told is a human one, messy and bureaucratic and entirely the fault of people with the best of intentions, which again is probably the more frightening answer. One thing I keep thinking about when I consider the virus origin is what it means for the people in the show who are still alive years into the apocalypse. The French lab failed to produce a cure. The CRM has been trying from a different angle, but nobody in the world of the show has actually found a way to eliminate the pathogen. Every living person in the franchise is still carrying the thing Jenna told Rick about. They always will be. The virus isn't going anywhere, which means the world they're building, the communities and the Commonwealth and all of it, is being built on top of a permanent condition, not a crisis to be solved, a new reality to be lived inside. That shift in framing, from catastrophe to condition, is, I think, what the later seasons of the show were trying to get to. Less about surviving the apocalypse and more about deciding what civilization looks like when the apocalypse is just the world. Since we're on the topic of the origin, let me briefly mention something the theory community has spent time on that I find genuinely interesting. If you accept the space spores answer, even tentatively, as a thought experiment, then the behaviour of the virus becomes a different kind of question. Terrestrial viruses evolve according to pressures that biologists can model. An extraterrestrial pathogen wouldn't necessarily follow those rules. It might have what you'd call an internal direction. Not intention, not intelligence, but a built-in trajectory encoded in its structure. Something it's moving toward across time, indifferent whether it gets there in a decade or a century. The variant walkers in this reading aren't an accident produced by clumsy human researchers. They're a stage. The pathogen is doing something, and the French lab happened to accelerate a process that was going to happen anyway. The burners in France are what walkers eventually become, given enough time and the right conditions. The question is what comes after that. And the space spore's origin also explains something that the terrestrial lab origin doesn't quite account for: why the virus behaves so specifically. It targets humans. It leaves animals alone. The show established this early and never retconned it. Domestic animals, wild animals, birds, insects, none of them appear to carry or transmit the pathogen, only humans. A naturally occurring or even a human-engineered virus would be unlikely to have that kind of species specificity unless it was designed for it. But a pathogen that evolved in a context where humans were the dominant life form it encountered, or was seeded by something that selected for human biology specifically, might have that specificity baked in. It's not proof of anything. The show never treated it as proof, but it's the kind of detail that, once you notice it, sits uncomfortably in the back of your mind when you're rewatching. Everything is dying, except the animals, except everything that isn't us. Right, so this one is a bit different from the others. This isn't a fan theory in the sense that fans invented it and the show never confirmed it. The show confirmed it. Slowly, in 2 stages, across the first 2 seasons. But a lot of people didn't fully register what was being confirmed, and I think it's worth sitting with it properly, because it changes the texture of the whole show once it lands. The setup is the season 1 finale. Rick and the survivors have made it to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, in Atlanta. It's the last outpost of any kind of official response to the outbreak. Dr. Edwin Jenner is the only scientist left. Everyone else either evacuated or, as he delicately puts it, opted out. He's been alone in the building for months, running experiments, trying to find answers, slowly losing the will to continue. The episode is quiet and melancholy, in a way the show had mostly avoided up to that point. There are showers and hot food and wine. People cry, people confess things, and at the very end, before Rick leads the group out of the building, which is about to self-destruct, Jenna pulls him aside and whispers something in his ear. The camera doesn't hear it. The audience doesn't hear it. Rick's face does something complicated. And then they run. The season 2 finale is where the other shoe drops. The group has had a terrible few months. They've lost people. Tensions have exploded, and in the chaos of leaving Herschel's farm, Rick finally says it out loud. We're all infected. Whatever it is, we all carry it. The bite doesn't cause the transformation. Everyone transforms when they die, regardless of whether they were ever bitten. The bite is just a wound that kills you, and then lets the virus do what it was already going to do eventually. Think about what that means for a moment. Every single person in the show, from the first episode to the last, was already carrying the thing that would turn them. Not infected in the sense of having been exposed to something external. Infected in the sense of already containing it, already host to it, from the moment the apocalypse began, or possibly before. The virus didn't spread through bites. The bites just hastened an inevitable process. The show never fully explored the implications of this, and I think that's a shame because the implications are genuinely strange. If the virus was already in everyone at the start of the show, it must have been in everyone for a while before the show. The moment of the outbreak, the moment when walkers first appeared, was presumably not the moment the virus first existed. It was the moment whatever dormant thing was living in human cells became active. The trigger, not the infection, which connects back to the French lab in an interesting way. If the pathogen was released into the environment, airborne, waterborne, absorbed through years of ordinary life, then it could have been quietly colonizing human biology for months or years before the first walker appeared. Everyone alive at the start of the show had been breathing it in or consuming it without knowing. The outbreak wasn't an infection event, it was an activation event. Something flipped a switch. I find this one of the more quietly devastating ideas in the whole show, because it means that from the very first scene, Rick in his hospital bed, the world still apparently normal, a cop on a stretcher, he was already carrying the thing that would eventually kill him and turn him. It was already there. It had been there for a while. He just didn't know yet. There's a reading of the show in which this is the whole point. The zombie apocalypse as a metaphor for mortality, not the external frightening kind that arrives unexpectedly, but the internal, inevitable kind that everyone carries from birth. We're all going to die. We all contain our own endings. The walkers aren't something that happened to the world. They're what the world was always heading toward. That's maybe a bit heavy for 2 a.m, but it's what Jenna whispered. There's more to that scene than the headline reveal, and I think the parts people forget are actually the most affecting. Jenna's wife was one of his test subjects. She was a virologist too. She was one of the people actually working on the problem when the world ended. She got infected, died, turned, and Jenna couldn't bring himself to put her down immediately. He kept her, he kept studying her. He called the brain scan TS19, Test Subject 19, and he watched the process of death and reanimation on a screen, scientifically, while underneath that professionalism, he was watching his wife die twice. He held on to her for as long as he could, and then he finally let her go, and then he was alone in the building for months. That context makes his whisper to Rick much more specific. He wasn't just passing on information. He was warning Rick that everyone he loved was already carrying the same process his wife carried. That no matter how careful Rick was, no matter how safe he kept his family, the ending was already written inside them. The bite is a wound. The virus is permanent. The distinction between infected and uninfected, which the early show gestured toward as something meaningful, was always false. There's also a detail the show confirmed much later in the spin-offs that adds another layer to the Jenna reveal. If the virus is genuinely airborne, or was airborne at the time of the outbreak, spread by contact with environmental contamination, then the population that survived the initial outbreak isn't a population of lucky people who weren't exposed. It's a population of people who were exposed and didn't die immediately from the initial infection. The virus is already in everyone. Jenna confirmed that. What nobody has ever confirmed is how long it's been there. The theory is that the virus had been circulating in some dormant or low-level form for years before the outbreak. The French lab didn't release something new into a clean world. It released something that accelerated a process that was already underway, and the people who survived the initial wave of deaths weren't immune. They were just lucky in the particular shape of their immune response to the early stages of the infection. Nobody is safe. Nobody was ever safe. They were all already inside the outcome from the beginning. I find the phone scene in the prison particularly interesting with this in mind. Rick, after Laurie's death, starts receiving calls on an unplugged phone. The voices are Laurie, Amy, Jim, Jackie, people who died, whose voices he's generating from grief and guilt, and the specific kind of breakdown that comes from losing someone, while carrying the knowledge that everyone you love is one bad day from the same ending. He wasn't hallucinating randomly. He was hallucinating specifically. The phone was his mind trying to process something it didn't have the capacity to process through normal means. The everyone was already infected reveal is the hidden engine underneath that breakdown. He knew what Jenna told him. He'd been living with it since the CDC. And then Laurie died. And the thing Jenna said became not a theoretical fact but a felt one. It was already in her. It was already in him. It was already in Carl. The phone was, in a way, the only appropriate response. There's a quiet extension of this theory that touches on the Commonwealth, which is the large surviving community the main show dealt with in its final seasons. The Commonwealth is a city of tens of thousands of people, with electricity and commerce and entertainment and class structure, a genuine attempt to rebuild something like the world that was. And one of the show's points about the Commonwealth, which it made with varying degrees of subtlety, is that the old world's problems came back with it. The hierarchy, the exploitation, the way resources get distributed based on who you were before rather than what you need now. The everyone was always infected framing is interesting in that context because it means the Commonwealth citizens are carrying the same thing as the people outside its walls. There's no clean line between the protected and the unprotected. There's just the illusion of one, maintained by walls and generators and the pretense of normalcy. The Commonwealth is in some ways a large-scale version of the same thing the coma theory suggests about Rick's hospital room. A constructed reality that feels real because it's the only reality available, and that maintains itself through the determined refusal to look at what's actually holding it up. The show didn't push that thread as hard as it could have, but it was there, and the everyone was always infected detail is part of why it lands at all. The apocalypse didn't create new problems, it removed the systems that had been managing old ones. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This one started as a theory and ended as a fact, which is a journey. And the fact is maybe more interesting than the theory was, because of what it means for the whole arc of the first 2 seasons and the way the show ended up distributing its legacy. The basics. Laurie Grimes had an affair with Shane Walsh, Rick's best friend, in the months after Rick was shot and before the zombie outbreak brought him back into their lives. She believed Rick was dead. Shane was there. One thing led to another. By the time Rick woke up and found his family and the world was ending, Laurie was already pregnant, and the timing meant the biological father could have been either Rick or Shane. The show was deliberately vague about this for a long time, letting it sit as unresolved tension. Fans worked out the likely answer from the timeline. The maths pointed at Shane. Robert Kirkman confirmed it in a Reddit AMA. Yes, in the comic, Judith is Shane's biological daughter. Rick knew it was possible, decided it didn't matter, and raised her as his own. And then season 7 of the show actually put it on screen. Rick confirming what he knew and demonstrating that it changed nothing about how he felt. What I find fascinating about this isn't the reveal itself. It's what it means for Shane's story. Shane Walsh was the first real villain of The Walking Dead. He was Rick's best friend, he was in love with Rick's wife, and he was fundamentally unable to accept that the old world's rules didn't apply anymore. He wanted things to be simple, and they weren't. He wanted to be the hero, and the show wouldn't let him be. He died in season 2, killed by Rick, then shot by Carl after he turned. He never knew he was going to be a father. He never got to be one. He spent his last weeks alive consumed by resentment and grief, and a love that couldn't find anywhere good to go. And then he died, and the world moved on. Except it didn't, quite, because his biological daughter lived. She survived Tuamichnus and the prison, and the governor, and Negan, and the Whisperers, and everything the world threw at her. She grew up. She became, by the end of the show, one of the most important characters in the franchise. The only character who is truly native to the post-apocalypse, who was born into it and shaped entirely by it, and has no memory of anything else. Shane wanted legacy. He wanted to matter. He wanted his love for Laurie to mean something lasting, and in the most sideways, unintended way imaginable, it did. His bloodline is the one that carries forward. His daughter is the one giving Daryl Dixon the first line of his spin-off. You deserve a happy ending too, and riding into the frame of the show's continuing mythology as the next generation. Rick raised her. Rick loved her. Rick is her father in every way that the word actually matters. But Shane is the biology, and that biology persisting across the whole run and into the spin-off era is one of the stranger cosmic jokes the show ever told. There's also a specific thing about Judith's relationship with Negan that I think the show handled quietly and well. Negan killed Glenn and Abraham with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. He was, for multiple seasons, the primary villain. And yet Judith, who grew up hearing about what he did, formed something like a genuine friendship with him in the later seasons. She lent him a compass. She talked to him like a person. She was the one character who seemed most willing to take the man at face value rather than the legend. And Negan, for his part, was consistently kinder to Judith than he was to almost anyone else, which connects to the next theory I want to talk about, actually. But that's for later. The point about Judith is that she is, in a very real sense, the product of the show's central tragedy. Two men loved the same woman, and one of them died for it, and the other raised his child. And then the child grew up and became the future. Shane never got to see any of it. Rick was gone before most of it. But Judith Grimes, half Shane's DNA, all Rick's upbringing, is the one who's still standing. There's a specific detail in the show's handling of Judith that I think is worth noting, because it's a small writing choice that has a lot of weight underneath it. When Judith appears as an older child in season 9 onwards, after the time jump, played by Kaylee Fleming, the show gives her Rick's hat and Michonne's katana. Not Shane's anything, not Laurie's anything. Rick's hat, Michonne's blade. She is coded visually as Rick's daughter and Michonne's adopted child, and the show seems committed to that framing. But there's a moment in the later seasons where Judith, talking to Negan, says something about understanding why people do terrible things when they're desperate or afraid. She's more forgiving, more interested in nuance, more able to sit with moral complexity than most adult characters on the show. And the question I find interesting is where that comes from. Rick was a moral man, but he was also a hard man who made hard calls without much ambiguity. Michonne was formidable and loving, but not particularly given to philosophical flexibility. Judith somehow ended up being the most morally nuanced character in the show's final seasons. There's a small theory that Judith's biological makeup, Shane's passionate, emotional, reckless temperament, filtered through Laurie's intelligence, and then shaped by Rick's discipline, produced something the show didn't quite plan for. A child who carries the tension of all those competing forces and resolved it into something genuinely her own. Not Rick, not Shane, not Laurie. Something that grew from all three and became its own thing. Which is, I think, the kindest possible reading of a story that began with an affair and a murder and produced somehow the person who gets to carry the franchise forward. There's a detail about Judith's position in the final episode of the main show that I think got underwritten at the time. She gets the last line, not Rick, who is still alive after escaping a CRM facility somewhere. Not Michonne, who went looking for him. Not Daryl, who eventually follows his own road. Judith Grimes gets the final spoken line of an 11-season television series that spent most of its run being Rick's story. That's a very specific choice, and it means something. The show is saying this is where the story passes, from the first generation to the second, from the people who remembered the world before to the person who was born into the world after. She's Shane's daughter, and Rick's daughter, and Michonne's adopted daughter, and Daryl's ward, and the show's future, all at once. That's a lot to put on one character. But the show put it there deliberately, and I think the weight of it mostly holds. This is a quieter one. It doesn't get talked about as much as the coma theory or the Breaking Bad crossover, but it's the one I keep coming back to, because it reframes the whole moral position of the show in a single scene that most people processed as a death episode and then moved on from. The episode is What Happened and What's Going On, Season 5. Tyrese is dying. He was bitten at Noah's settlement, a place they'd gone to in the hope of finding community, only to find it had already been destroyed. And the episode follows his last hours through a series of hallucinations. He sees the governor. He sees Lizzie and Mika, the sisters he'd watched die. He sees Martin, the Terminus man who had threatened his life. He sees Bob. They talk to him as he fades in and out. The hallucinations are remarkable pieces of television, genuinely. The governor and Martin representing the horror Tyrese had been through. Lizzie and Mika offering something like forgiveness. Bob somewhere in between. And threading through all of it is a radio broadcast, a voice reporting on events happening somewhere in the world. Atrocities, murders, a group of people moving through the country and leaving destruction behind them. The voice, confirmed afterwards by director Greg Nicotero on The Talking Dead, was Andrew Lincoln. Not in his Rick Grimes accent, in his natural voice, his real voice, his British accent, which is quite different from the Georgia drawl Rick normally uses. What the broadcast was describing, and this was confirmed as deliberate, not accidental, was the story of Rick's group. The cannibalism at Terminus, when Rick's people killed Gareth and his followers at the church after escaping to Amichnus, the brutal murders at various points along their journey, the burnt houses, the bodies left at Noah's community, the trail of violence that followed wherever they went. The fan reading of this is not that Rick's group are secretly evil, it's something subtler. It's that the narrative the show presented, Rick's group as the heroes doing what they must to survive, is not the only possible narrative. From the outside, from the perspective of someone who didn't know these people, who didn't understand their reasoning, who was just cataloguing what they left behind, they look terrifying. They look like exactly the kind of threat every settlement the show has ever depicted was right to be afraid of. Andrew Lincoln's real accent is the tell, I think. The show is briefly stepping outside its own framing. Rick's voice becomes Rick's actor's voice, someone narrating events about a fictional group he plays, from a perspective that isn't inside the story. It lasts a few seconds, and in those seconds the show allows itself to say, we know these people are the heroes. We know why they do what they do, but here is what those actions look like from the outside. Tyree's dying is the right character to hear this. He was one of the people in the group who struggled most consistently with the moral costs of survival. He didn't want to kill. He wanted to believe the world still had room for kindness. He held on to that belief longer than almost anyone, and the show killed him for it, which is its own statement. But before he went, it gave him this radio broadcast, a different account of the story he'd been living. I don't think the theory is that Rick's group are the villains. I think the theory is that the show knows they're not entirely the heroes either, and the radio broadcast is one moment where it says that out loud, very quietly, in a dying man's hallucination, using the actor's real voice as the signal that we've briefly stepped outside the fiction. That's rather beautiful, actually, even if it only lasts a few seconds. The hallucination sequence as a whole is worth spending time on, not just the radio. The episode was directed by Greg Nicotero, who had been involved with the show from the very beginning as a special effects supervisor and director. He clearly wanted to do something unusual with it. The whole episode has a different visual register from the rest of the show. Softer light in the hallucination sequences, a queasy back and forth between what's real and what isn't. Music choices that don't feel like anything else the show had done up to that point. It's one of the few episodes that could sit alongside the very best of what prestige television was producing at the time. What the episode does with the hallucination figures is genuinely clever. The governor and Martin are, in Tyrese's mind, the voices of accusation. They represent the violence he participated in, the times he killed, the moments where survival required him to do things that didn't fit who he wanted to be. And Lizzie and Mika, two young girls he failed to protect, one of whom he had to watch die, are the voices of something like absolution. They're not angry with him. They forgive him. And that forgiveness is what allows him to let go. The radio sits somewhere between those two poles. It's not clearly condemnatory. It's not clearly forgiving. It's just informational. A broadcast describing events. The tone is that of any radio news program, covering a story from a distance. Not emotionally invested. Not making moral judgments. Just reporting what happened and where. And what it reports is Rick's group story, from the outside with no context for why they did what they did. A lot of fans read this as the show suggesting Rick's group are villains. I don't think that's quite it. I think the show is suggesting something more specific, that context is everything, and that most of the people in the world of The Walking Dead who became their enemies had their own context. The governor thought he was protecting Woodbury. The people at Tuaminhus had a backstory the show eventually revealed. The saviors were, in some of their own minds, providing a service. Every group that Rick's group fought believed they were the survivors, and Rick's people were the threat. The radio is giving Tyrese the version of his story that people outside the story believe. It's not the truth exactly, but it's not entirely wrong either. And there's something fitting about it being Tyrese who hears it, because Tyrese spent more of the show than almost anyone else asking whether what they were doing was right. He held on to the idea that there was a better way. He resisted the hardening that everyone around him seemed to undergo more easily. And in his dying moments, the show gives him the one perspective that might have made him feel most conflicted. The outside account of the group he belonged to. And then it gives him the girls, and it gives him forgiveness, and it lets him go. The British accent is still the detail I find most haunting. Andrew Lincoln out of character, reporting on his own character's actions as if from a radio tower somewhere in a world that never knew Rick Grimes personally. It lasts a few seconds. If you don't know to listen for it, you might not register it consciously. But something about it lands anyway, I think. Something about a voice you recognise speaking in a register you've never heard them use does something to the ear that straight dialogue doesn't. The helicopter appears in Season 1, Episode 1. Rick is in a helicopter, dreaming maybe, or hallucinating, it's not entirely clear. And then later, wandering through Atlanta, he spots a real helicopter flying overhead. It's there and gone. The show treats it as atmosphere, as world texture. Someone is still operating aircraft. Someone out there has resources and fuel and organisation. The world isn't entirely gone. It took nearly a decade to find out who was in that helicopter. The helicopter group, eventually named the Civic Republic Military, or CRM, became one of the longest-running mysteries in the franchise. They appeared in the background of multiple seasons. They had a distinctive logo, 3 overlapping circles. Fans catalogued their appearances across years of episodes, building a map of how far their reach extended. But the show was slow, genuinely slow to explain them. What they were doing with the people they took is where it gets interesting. A character named Anne, who had previously gone by Jadis and led a community called the Scavengers, turned out to be working for the CRM as a sort of procurement agent. She was categorizing people she encountered as either A or B. The show was deliberately opaque about what those categories meant, but the fan theories were immediate and varied. A's and B's as different personality types. A's as leaders, B's as followers, A's as the dangerous ones, B's as the compliant ones. The categories felt clinical in a way that implied the CRM was running some kind of program. Rick leaving in Season 9 is the most watched moment of the show's later seasons. He blew up a bridge to stop a herd of walkers, was apparently killed, and was then swept away by a helicopter while still barely alive. The show kept him off screen for years. A whole spin-off, The Ones Who Live, which aired in 2024, was built around finally answering what happened to him. What happened to him was this. The CRM took him, integrated him into their program, spent years trying to convince him to become one of them, and eventually he and Michonne, who had gone looking for him, found a way out. The CRM's stated mission was rebuilding civilization, protecting a city called the Civic Republic, and researching a potential cure. The reality was more complicated. They were militaristic, controlling, willing to commit atrocities to protect their vision of what the future should look like. The connection to the French lab from the world beyond post-credits scene suggests the CRM knew more about the virus origin than they let on, possibly knew about the French research, possibly were involved in attempts to understand or reverse it. They had a facility working on a cure. They had what looked like zombie test subjects in controlled environments. They were the only organisation in the post-apocalyptic world still operating at the scale needed to actually study the problem scientifically, Whether they were trying to save the world or control the world's eventual reconstruction is the question the franchise left somewhat open. Probably both, in the way that large, powerful institutions usually mean both things at once. What I find most interesting about the CRM storyline is how long the show trusted the mystery. The helicopter in episode 1 of season 1, the first appearance of the logo in background shots, the slow accumulation of evidence across 9 years of television before it started to cohere. That's a remarkable amount of patience from the writers. Most shows can't sustain a mystery for 9 seasons without either paying it off too early or forgetting about it. The Walking Dead just kept adding pieces, very quietly, for almost a decade. The fan theories about the CRM were, for a long time, better than the eventual answer, which is often the case with long-running mysteries. But the foundation was genuinely impressive. That first helicopter wasn't an accident. Someone in 2010 made a decision to put that detail in the pilot and trust that the show would eventually be around long enough to pay it off. That's a fairly remarkable act of faith in a series that was, at the time, completely unproven. One of the theories that circulated for years, and that I find worth mentioning because it was so widely believed, was that the helicopter group was actually the US government, or a remnant of it, operating covertly to find people with specific traits that might hold the key to a cure. The AB classification would be about immune response, or psychological resilience, or some other biological marker that distinguished people who might be useful research subjects from people who weren't. Rick being an A, which was implied though never spelled out, would mean he had something in him worth studying. The actual answer was somewhat different, and somewhat more mundane in its mechanics, if not in its implications. But the theory was compelling because it gave the whole apparatus of the CRM a scientific logic that made sense within the world the show had built. They weren't just another faction, another group of people building power for its own sake. They were the people who still believed in the idea of a solution, and that made them both more sympathetic and more dangerous than a simple villain. Because in a world without rules, the people who think they have the answer to everything, who believe their vision of the future is the only vision worth protecting, tend to do the worst things. The CRM killed entire settlements to maintain operational secrecy. They did it with paperwork and procedure, which somehow makes it worse. Not chaos, not cruelty, just policy. There's a fan theory about the AB classification that I find more interesting than the immune response reading, though. The theory is that A's are people who have fully crossed the moral line, people who have killed other living humans, who have made the decision that survival requires that, and who are therefore psychologically capable of operating within the CRM system. And B's are people who haven't crossed that line yet, people who might still be reachable, who might still have the moral flexibility to be shaped by the CRM's ideology rather than having to be broken first. Rick in this reading would be an A. He killed Shane, he killed the claimers, he made 100 hard calls that put him clearly on one side of a line. The CRM would have known that about him and would have valued it, because people who have already made those decisions don't require the same convincing. Jadis, meanwhile, would have understood herself as an A too. She traded both categories to the CRM, but her own status as someone who had made similarly hard calls would be clear. The whole exchange system she ran with the scavengers reads quite differently once you know it was a procurement operation for a military organisation that categorised people by their willingness to do violence. What the ones who live eventually confirmed is that the CRM's model was at its core a survivalist ideology taken to its logical endpoint. They had done the maths as they saw it on civilization's chances. They had concluded that the only communities that would make it in the long run were the ones that were willing to be ruthless, disciplined, and selective. They weren't collecting people out of altruism. They were curating a gene pool and a skill set for the world they intended to build, which is one of those ideas that sounds reasonable in the abstract and horrifying in the specific. Most grand plans to save humanity look fine as architecture and appalling as implemented policy. The CRM's version of civilization was clean and functional and built on a foundation of quietly erased settlements and classified research and a hierarchy that nobody outside it had consented to. Rick spending years trying to escape it rather than join it is the right character choice for him. He already lived through the Saviors. He knew what that structure cost. The 3 overlapping circles of the CRM logo, which fans spent years trying to decode, are officially explained as representing the 3 communities of the Civic Republic, Philadelphia, Portland, and Omaha, the 3 city-states the CRM is protecting. Simple enough in retrospect, but the symbol does something else visually. It looks like 3 overlapping constraints, 3 circles each of which is limited by the other 2, which is either coincidental design or a quietly pointed statement about what the organization actually was. Probably coincidental, but it fits. Right, so this one is a bit more speculative than some of the others. It doesn't have a Reddit thread with 10,000 upvotes. It doesn't get discussed in the main fan theory compilations very often, but I think about it quite a lot because it reframes Negun's entire character in a way that makes him considerably more interesting and considerably more sympathetic, which is saying something, given that he arrived on screen by murdering 2 beloved characters with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. The theory is this: Negun is sterile, or at the very least, he and his wives never produced any children. And that absence is the key to understanding almost everything about him. The setup requires a bit of maths. Negun, when we meet him, has multiple wives, a small harem essentially, that he maintains at the sanctuary as both a practical arrangement and a statement of power. The structure is polygamous in the traditional sense. 1 dominant man, several women, a social hierarchy built around proximity to him. Historically, that structure tends to produce offspring. That's sort of the point of it, from an evolutionary perspective. Men in positions of power with multiple partners tend to have children, sometimes a lot of children. Negun, across multiple seasons, has a son, not 1. The subject never comes up. The spin-off, Here's Negun, which gives us his backstory, the gym teacher, the wife Lucille, her cancer, his absolute devotion to her through her illness and death, shows a marriage without children as well. 2 people who loved each other and didn't have kids, and then one of them died, and the other one became this. The theory is that Negun has always known he couldn't have children, that the harem at the sanctuary is, among other things, a way of performing fertility and power without the outcome that would normally accompany it, and that the hole that knowledge left in him never healed, which is why his relationships with other people's children are so striking, the Carl stuff in particular. Negun and Carl developed something that the show itself seemed uncertain about, a relationship that was clearly paternal from Negun's side in ways the show kept gesturing toward without fully committing to. Carl attempts to assassinate Negun in Season 7. Negun, instead of killing him, takes him on a tour of the sanctuary, shows him around, listens to him, then brings him home to Alexandria, where he cooks for Carl and baby Judith, teaches Carl to shave, and sits at Rick's table, waiting for Rick to come back. Before the outbreak, Negun was a high school gym teacher. Carl is roughly the right age to have been one of his students. The paternal dynamic is not accidental. With Judith, it's even more pronounced. The compass, the conversations, the way Dead City frames Negun, genuinely changed, genuinely trying to be good, as someone whose most authentic self is the man trying to protect a child. His whole redemption arc, the thing that actually works about it, is centered on people younger than him who have nothing to do with his specific grievances. There's something in the theory about legacy too, a man who knows he won't leave biological descendants and who therefore builds everything else. The sanctuary, the rules, the saviors, the whole structure, as a monument to his own permanence. The apocalypse gave him the one context in which he could be the most powerful man in the room, and he filled that context with the things, a man fills it with when legacy by normal means isn't available to him. Systems, followers, stories about who he is and what he stands for. And then the systems collapsed, and what he was left with was the paternal instinct that had been trying to come out all along. Judith, the compass, trying to help Maggie get her kid back in Dead City. The whole arc resolves, in the end, on a man who spent years being the most feared person in the room and turned out to actually want to be the kind of person a kid trusts. I don't know if the sterility theory is true. The show never confirmed it, but it fits. Everything it implies fits. And it makes Negan's origin story, Lucille's cancer, the devotion, the way her death cracked the world open for him, feel like it has an extra layer of weight underneath it. One thing worth noting about Here's Negan, both the comic prequel and the episode the show eventually devoted to his backstory, is how much of it is about Lucille specifically. Not the apocalypse, not survival, not power. Lucille. She was sick before the world ended. She was going through chemotherapy. Negan was, by his own account, a lousy husband for most of their marriage. Cheating, inattentive, not the man she deserved. And then she got sick, and he stopped everything else and became completely devoted to her. He stayed. He took care of her. He watched her deteriorate with a kind of helpless, furious tenderness that the show rendered quite movingly. And then she died. The Walker apocalypse began while Lucille was still alive, and Negan, who had just remade himself into a man capable of profound devotion, had nobody left to direct that devotion at. The Sanctuary and the Saviours, viewed through this lens, are less a straightforward power grab, and more what happens when an enormous capacity for love turns inward in the absence of its object. Negan took over the Sanctuary. He named his bat after his dead wife. He surrounded himself with people who needed protection and gave them that protection in exchange for their compliance. He created conditions where he was permanently necessary, permanently loved in the transactional sense, permanently the most important person in any given room, none of which filled the hole. That's the thing about the sterility theory that makes it work so well as a character key. It's not that Negan's drive for power is separate from his grief. It's that the power and the grief are the same thing. He's building a legacy because he cannot build a biological one. He's collecting followers because he cannot collect children. He's naming his weapon after his wife because the weapon is all he has that still carries her name. And then Carl came along. This angry, one-eyed teenager who tried to assassinate him and who Negan responded to not with punishment, but with something like delighted recognition. Of all the people in the world, Carl Grimes was the one who looked Negan in the face without fear and said, in essence, "I see you and I still think you're wrong." Negan loved him for that. He couldn't help it. In Season 7, Negan goes to Alexandria, cooks spaghetti, shaves his beard, and waits for Rick. He's domestically competent in a way that suggests he wasn't always the king of a brutalist compound. He knows how to be in a kitchen. He knows how to be patient with a child. He knows how to sit at someone else's table and feel, at least temporarily, like that table belongs to him. It's the gym teacher. It's the version of himself from before Lucille got sick, before everything collapsed, still in there, showing up in the strangest circumstances. Dead City is, in some ways, the completion of that character arc. Negan in New York, trying to protect Maggie's son, the son of one of the men he murdered, doing the thing that apparently was always going to be the thing, being the person who protects children. Not because he's been redeemed in some neat narrative sense, but because it's the shape his capacity for care was always going to take once the sanctuary stopped being an option. I think that's the right ending for him, honestly. Not a hero, not a villain. Just a man whose best instincts were always paternal, finally in a situation where that's the most useful thing he can be. One last thought on the sterility theory, and then we'll move on. The theory also reframes the wives at the sanctuary in a way I find worth mentioning. The standard reading of that arrangement is power and control, which it clearly was, at least in part. But if you accept that Negun knew or suspected he was sterile, then the harem isn't primarily about producing heirs. It can't be. It's about performance. It's about the appearance of a man who has everything, including multiple partners, including the full apparatus of patriarchal dominance, specifically to mask the absence of the thing that would make it mean something. The wives are a display case for a kind of power he doesn't actually have. And the women in that arrangement are, of course, coerced. The show's clear about that, and Negun's later reckoning with it is part of what makes his redemption arc complicated rather than clean. He understood eventually what he'd built and what it had cost. That understanding is part of why Dead City works as well as it does. A man trying to be useful without being in charge, trying to protect without controlling, trying to figure out who he is when the display case is gone. This one is recent enough that it doesn't have the same long fan theory history as some of the others. It's more of a slow realization that happened across the spin-offs, a thing the show started gesturing toward, and then started saying out loud in ways that changed the long-term picture of the franchise. Go back to Season 1, Episode 1. Rick, fresh out of his hospital bed, encounters a walker in a house, the bottom half of a woman, crawling toward him across a lawn, and later when he returns, she seems to recognize him. Not in a she's actually alive way, in a something behind those eyes is registering this person way. The show treated it as atmosphere and didn't return to it, but it was there. There are other moments, a walker in Season 1 who opens a door, turns the handle specifically, which requires a degree of motor memory and intentionality that the usual shambling dead don't demonstrate. Small things. Gestures towards something the show mostly kept in the background. The Whisperers, in the later seasons, complicated things further. Alpha and Beta and their group had learned to live among walkers by wearing their skin and moving at their pace. And the implication of that, the thing the show circled without quite stating, was that the boundary between living and dead was blurrier than anyone had previously acknowledged. The walkers could be managed, directed, integrated with. They were dangerous but not entirely without pattern. And then came the variants. The Daryl Dixon spin-off set in France introduced walkers that behaved differently from anything the main show established. The Burners, walkers with acidic skin and blood that can severely burn anyone they touch. Not thinking exactly, not planning, but operating with a kind of efficiency that the walkers back home in America don't demonstrate. They're the product of the French lab's mutation experiments, the failed attempts to eradicate the virus that instead produced something worse. What the variants imply when you sit with it is that the virus is not static. It was human engineered or human modified, and when humans modified it, it changed in ways they didn't anticipate. And if it changed once, it can change again. There's a specific fan theory that builds from this. The virus is doing something. Not consciously, not with intention. Viruses don't have intentions, but the way evolution does something. It's moving toward a version of itself that spreads better, lasts longer, produces better vectors. The variant walkers are faster and more dangerous, which makes them more effective at transmitting the virus and ending the lives of survivors. If you were a virus trying to persist, you'd want your hosts to be more mobile, more aggressive, more capable of finding new people to infect. The space spores answer to the origin question, which Kirkman suggested, and then walked back, adds an extra layer here. If the virus is of extraterrestrial origin, it might be operating on a timeline and toward an outcome that human biology simply isn't equipped to recognise. The walkers might not be the end point, they might be an intermediate stage. What comes next is something the franchise has so far declined to show. The child Laurent in the Daryl Dixon spin-off, born to a mother who died and reanimated while pregnant, raised by people who believe he might be immune, gestures toward another direction the show could go. What if human biology can eventually produce a version of itself that accommodates the virus rather than being destroyed by it? What if the apocalypse, given enough time, produces not just evolved walkers, but evolved survivors? That's a long way from the show's beginning, but then the show began with a cop at a gas station in a small Georgia town, and it ended with multiple international spin-offs and a mythology that spans 2 continents and a decade of storytelling. The franchise has room to go places the original show never imagined. And there's a version of the variant walker theory that connects back to the virus origin in an interesting way. If the virus is of non-terrestrial origin, if it came from outside the normal biological rules of this planet, then it might not behave the way a human-designed pathogen would. Human-designed viruses, when they mutate, follow evolutionary pressures we can at least partially model. They become more contagious, or more lethal, or both. They compete with each other for hosts. They can be interrupted by vaccines, or herd immunity, or medical intervention. An alien pathogen, or a pathogen that originated from alien genetic material, might not follow those patterns. It might have an internal logic we can't read. The mutations the French lab accidentally produced might not be random in the way that viral mutations normally are. They might be directional. Something about the pathogen might be selecting for specific outcomes. Walkers that are better at finding and infecting hosts, survivors that are harder to kill, eventually maybe something in between. The walker variant in Daryl Dixon that can apparently operate with more apparent awareness, reacting to its environment, moving in more coordinated ways, responding to stimuli more efficiently than standard walkers, reads in this light less like a failed cure and more like an intermediate stage. The virus adapting, not toward anything the researchers intended, towards something the virus, or whatever intelligence analogue it contains, needed. I know that sounds like I'm attributing intention to a pathogen, which is not how viruses work, but the space spore's origin puts this in a different category. If the material originated off-planet, it might encode something in its structure that human virology has no framework for reading. The French researchers thought they were working with a disease. They might have been working with something that has its own telos. The child Laurent in the Daryl Dixon spin-off is the most explicit version of this thread. A child born from a mother who died and reanimated while he was in utero, and who somehow survived, somehow developed without the virus behaving the way it should in his cells. The factions in France who believe he's significant, a messiah figure, an immune individual, the key to a cure, are projecting their own frameworks onto something they don't understand. But the fact that he exists, that his biology produced something anomalous, suggests the virus can be in a person without following its normal course, which raises a question the show has been circling for the whole spin-off era without quite asking directly. What if the endpoint of this isn't walkers everywhere forever? What if the endpoint is something the world hasn't reached yet? The variant walkers suggest the dead are changing. Laurent suggests the living might be changing too. The story the franchise is telling is apparently not finished, and the direction it seems to be heading is towards some kind of reckoning between what the virus is doing to the dead and what it might eventually produce in the living. I don't know what that ending looks like, but I find myself more interested in it than I was in the final seasons of the main show. The mythology got more interesting when it started admitting that nobody actually understood what was happening. And since we're talking about walkers and whether they're changing, I want to briefly revisit the Whisperers, because I think they're underrated as a piece of mythology. Alpha, Beta, their group. They're usually discussed in terms of how terrifying they were as villains, which fair enough. But what they actually represent in the show's mythology is a community of people who made a choice to stop treating the boundary between living and dead as absolute. They lived among walkers, they wore their skin, they moved at their pace and accepted their smell and their logic. They decided that the dead were not the enemy, just a condition of the world, and that the best survival strategy was integration rather than opposition. That's a fascinating idea, and the show never quite decided what to do with it. The Whisperers are villains because of the specific violence they commit. The Pike scene is one of the most genuinely horrifying things the show ever did, but their underlying philosophy is not obviously wrong. The people who have been fighting walkers since the beginning are still fighting walkers. The Whisperers found a different relationship with them. Whether that's madness or adaptation is a question the show raised and then answered through violence rather than argument. The variant walker theory connects here, because if the walkers are genuinely evolving, then the Whisperers were perhaps ahead of the curve. They weren't integrating with the dead as they exist now. They were integrating with an early version of what the dead might become. Whatever the variant walkers are developing toward, the Whisperers were already living adjacent to it, which makes Alpha less purely a monster and more a person who was reading the trajectory of the world differently from everyone else, and who was right about some things, even when she was catastrophically wrong about others. There's a version of the Walking Dead mythology in which the Whisperers weren't the last word on human-walker coexistence, but the first draft of it, something the world is still working out. Given Laurent in France and the direction the spin-offs seem to be heading, that version feels more plausible than it did when the Whisperer arc ended. Right, last one. And this one is a bit different from the others, because it's less about a specific mystery or a debated theory, and more about a pattern in the show's history that the spin-offs have since confirmed. The theory is this: despite being presented as Rick's story, The Walking Dead was always actually Daryl's story. Rick was the premise, Daryl was the heart, and the show figured that out somewhere around season 3, even if it took the rest of the run to act on it. Start with the origin. Daryl Dixon is not in the comics. He doesn't exist in Robert Kirkman's original source material. He was invented for the television adaptation because Norman Reedus came into audition for the role of Merle, the older, more abrasive Dixon brother, and the producers wanted Reedus in the show, but felt Reedus and the Merle character weren't quite the right fit. So they invented a brother, a quieter, more contained version of the Dixon energy, a character who would appear in a few episodes and probably die somewhere in the first season once he'd served his narrative purpose. Obviously, that's not what happened. Daryl's first season is relatively modest. He's useful. He has the crossbow, which became immediately iconic in a way nobody planned. He has a dynamic with the group that runs on competence rather than charisma. He doesn't make speeches, he just goes and does the thing. When the show needed someone to look for Sophia for episodes on end through the second half of season 2, it was Daryl, because he was the one character whose grief felt most authentic and most contained. And then somewhere in season 3, the show started building around him in ways that suggested the writers knew they had something special on their hands. The relationship with Carol, the friendship with Rick that deepened in ways the Rick-Shane dynamic never quite managed. The backstory with Merle, which added a whole dimension of family trauma and class anxiety that the show was mostly too busy to explore with other characters. By season 4, Daryl was the character the audience most consistently responded to. By season 5, he was effectively the second lead. By season 9, when Andrew Lincoln left the show, Daryl didn't just survive the departure. He absorbed most of the show's emotional weight and carried on. The show ran 3 more seasons after Rick's exit. Daryl was the central figure throughout. After The Walking Dead ended, spin-offs, Dead City, Daryl Dixon, and The Ones Who Live were created, and Dead City and Daryl Dixon are still running. Daryl Dixon, now in its 3rd season set in France, exploring corners of the mythology that the original show never had time to reach. The first line of that spin-off, the very first sound you hear, is Judith Grimes saying, "You deserve a happy ending too." That line was taken from an earlier recording. It wasn't new material, it was archival, the show reaching back into its own catalogue to find the right way to send Daryl off. And the line it found was from a child who never knew the world before the apocalypse. telling the man who had been protecting her since her father disappeared that he'd earned something good. There's a version of the theory that's a bit more pointed. The show subconsciously replaced Rick with Daryl years before Andrew Lincoln left, and by the time Rick's exit actually happened, the substitution was already complete. The audience had already transferred their primary emotional investment. The show had already been building around the character who was never supposed to matter. Rick's departure was a shock because it was dramatic and unexpected, but the show survived it because it had been preparing for it, quietly, for half a decade. And Daryl Dixon, who was invented on a Tuesday afternoon because a producer liked an actor but didn't have the right part for him, ended up as the franchise anchor, the last man standing, still going, still in a new country, still carrying a crossbow. Which is honestly the most Walking Dead outcome imaginable. The most important thing in the end turns out to be the thing nobody planned for. You build a careful structure, and the unplanned element is the one that holds everything up. Pretty wild. There's a companion theory to this one that I want to mention, which is slightly more specific. The theory is that the show killed the wrong character in season 8. Not Glenn, that's a different argument for a different time, but Carl. Carl Grimes was set up from the very beginning of the show to be Rick's legacy, the boy who would carry forward what his father had built. The comic kept him alive all the way through, aged him into a young adult, gave him a love interest and a role in the post-Knee Gun world that the comic eventually showed in a time jump epilogue. The show killed him in season 8 from a walker bite, and the decision reportedly came from the showrunners rather than the actor, which made it logistically necessary but narratively catastrophic. Because Carl's death did something to Rick's arc that the show never fully recovered from. Rick had been fighting for his son. That was the spine of his motivation. Not just surviving, not just building, but ensuring Carl had a world worth living in. When Carl died, that spine snapped. Rick's subsequent season 9 arc, the bridges, the final episodes, the explosion, is compelling on its own terms, but it lacks the through line that Carl's presence provided. The show was building a 2-generation story and then deleted one of the generations. Daryl's spin-off is interesting in part because it's doing the thing Carl was supposed to do. It's showing us what the next stage of the world looks like, through someone who knew the old world and survived into the new one, asking what it means to live now rather than just to endure. Daryl isn't a young man in France. He's middle-aged, weathered, carrying a long history, but the spin-off treats him with a curiosity about who he is when he's not protecting someone, which is the question Carl would eventually have been asked too. There's a line from Norman Reedus in various interviews about what he thought Daryl's story was always about. A man who never felt like he belonged anywhere, finding out that he was always exactly where he was supposed to be. The crossbow wasn't planned. The character wasn't planned. The whole spin-off wasn't planned, not in 2010. And yet here we are, years later, watching Daryl Dixon walk through Paris, still alive, still carrying arrows, still slightly awkward in social situations, still somehow the emotional centre of a franchise that has outlasted most of the people who built it. The theory that the show was always his is confirmed not by anything the writers said, but by what the show did when given the choice. Every time the franchise needed someone to be the anchor, after Beth died, after Merle died, after Glenn died, after Rick left, after Carl died, it reached for Daryl. Not because he was planned as the protagonist, because he'd proven over and over that the audience trusted him with that weight. That's not something you can plan. That's something that happens, and then you follow it. And since we're talking about Daryl specifically, I want to mention the crossbow one more time, because I think it's underrated as a piece of character design. The crossbow requires the same kill shot as a gun, but takes much longer and requires much more skill. It's patient, it's quiet, it demands precision, and it punishes recklessness. In a show full of characters who have varying relationships with violence, Daryl's weapon says something specific about him. He kills when he has to, he takes his time, he doesn't waste. And he's been using it since episode 3 of season 1, which someone put in his hands on a Tuesday afternoon when they were figuring out how to make a character work, and which has been in his hands ever since. That's the whole theory, really. Some things just fit, so that's 10 of them, 10 theories about a show that ran for 11 seasons and apparently never fully stopped generating things to think about. What I find interesting, having gone through all of these, is how much they say about why the show mattered in the first place. Fan theories aren't really about whether you can prove something. They're about caring enough to keep turning something over in your mind long after the obvious reading has been exhausted. You don't theorize about things you don't love. You theorize about the gaps in things you love, because the gaps feel like promises. The Walking Dead had a lot of gaps. Some of them were intentional. Kirkman, for all his deleted tweets and ambiguous answers, was genuinely thoughtful about what he left unsaid. Some of them were accidental. The show ran long enough that things introduced early on outlasted the people who originally planted them. And some of them are just the natural consequence of telling a story with this much mythology across this many years. Things accumulate. Things connect in ways nobody anticipated. The blue meth in Merle's stash was probably a simple Easter egg, but once it's there, and the imagination fills in the rest. There's a theory I didn't include in the main list tonight that I keep meaning to discuss properly in its own video: the governor's fish tank heads. The governor kept the severed heads of walkers in aquarium tanks in his apartment in Woodbury. The show presented it as evidence of his psychological unravelling, which it clearly was, but fans spent quite a lot of time trying to work out the logic of it. The most interesting interpretation wasn't that it was senseless cruelty, it was that the governor, who had watched his daughter turn and couldn't bring himself to put her down, was keeping the heads as a kind of practice, a way of sitting with the dead without them being able to hurt him. A controlled environment where the dead were contained and observable, and still, in some very limited sense, present. He watched the fish tanks the way someone might watch an old photograph of someone they've lost, unable to grieve properly, unwilling to let go, but aware that what he was holding on to was no longer the thing he loved. That's a fairly sophisticated piece of psychology for what appears at first glance to be just a villain doing villain things, and I think it speaks to what the show was best at: using the zombie apocalypse as a mechanism for exploring grief in forms that realism wouldn't allow. And there's the question of his daughter Penny, kept chained in a corner of his apartment, talked to as if she still understood him. There's a small theory that she actually did on some level, that the Walker version of Penny retained some ghost of recognition for her father. Not consciousness, not the ability to respond or communicate, but something in her behaviour around him that was subtly different from her behaviour around strangers. Something in her neural patterns, worn into muscle memory so deep the virus couldn't fully erase it, that still registered the face she'd seen every day of her life. The show never confirmed this, but it kept gesturing at exceptions to the rule that the dead were completely gone. The walker with the bicycle in episode 1, the door handle, the governor's daughter turning toward her father. I think the show was always quietly asking whether death was the complete erasure it appeared to be, or whether something persisted. Not enough to matter practically, not enough to make the walkers less dangerous, but enough to make the world of the show genuinely haunted. That thread runs through everything we covered tonight. The coma theory is about whether the world is real. The virus origin is about whether the apocalypse was inevitable or accidental. The Jenna reveal is about whether anyone was ever clean. The Tyrese radio is about whether the heroes were ever really the heroes. The variant walkers are about where this ends. None of these questions have clean answers. Some have been answered partially, and the partial answers generated new questions. The franchise is still going, in its spin-off form, still adding pieces. Daryl Dixon in France, variant walkers, a child who might be immune, the French lab, and its unfinished business. The ones who live gave us Rick and Michonne back, at least briefly. Dead City has a second season coming. There's more story left to tell and more gaps in that story that fans will immediately start filling with their own interpretations. I have a whole other list of theories I want to get to, the Michonne ones, the Morgan immortality discussion, a few specific Commonwealth theories that I find genuinely fascinating. I'm planning a video on those soon, so if you want to catch it when it comes out, subscribing is probably the most reliable way to do that. But for tonight, let's let it sit here. 10 theories, some confirmed, some likely, some beautiful, and probably false, some that change the whole texture of the show when you hold them up against it. All of them evidence that, whatever else The Walking Dead was or wasn't over its long run, it was the kind of story people couldn't stop thinking about. Which is the highest compliment you can pay a piece of fiction, honestly. Not that it was perfect, not that it never let you down, just that it gave you enough to keep turning over. For years, well past the point when you expected to have moved on. Whether it all gets answered in the end, I genuinely don't know. But I think about the first time I watched Rick Grimes wake up in that empty hospital. The quiet of it, the wrongness of it, the sense that the world he was going to walk out into had rules that didn't match the world he went to sleep in. That image has stayed with me. It stays with a lot of people, and I suppose that's why years after the finale, we're still here at whatever time it is talking about space spores and coma dreams and a dead man's daughter who grew up to carry a hat and a pistol and be the most important person